hopefully. There we go. So I should be able to see if anybody new pops in. There we go. So as I said before, thank you so much for joining me. This is the first of our Birds Meet sessions that the Urban Bird Program is going to be putting on this year. We've got a really nice suite of talks coming up once a month for everybody. So we're kicking it off with an oldie but a goodie. It's how to do birds in backyard surveys and why the surveys are important, how we use the data. Because it's always valuable to know that the information you're putting in is getting used. Before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that everybody's calling in from today, and I'm sure we've got people from across the country. I am calling in from Dharawal land today, where it was a beautiful day, I have to say. I walked my daughter to school and I walked her home again, and the sun was shining. There weren't too many birds around. It was a pretty quiet bird day, but I did see a few sulphur-crested cockatoos, and I had a little pied currawong in my front yard eating the lily pillies this afternoon, which was nice to see. So if you'd like, you can share what country you're calling in from in the chat. You could also let us know what your favourite bird is, or a bird that you saw today as well. Hopefully everybody saw something nice and engaging. And I think that's one of the good things about something like Birds in Backyard surveys is every time you go out, you're going to see something. Most of the time it's going to be a bird that you like seeing. There are always some exceptions, but you're always going to see something that you can record, and all of that data is really important. So what we're going to do today is go through, I'm just going to admit these people, there we go, and just remind everybody to pop themselves on chat. Pop themselves on mute, sorry, as we go through the session. For those who don't know me, my name's Holly Parsons. I'm the Urban Bird Program Manager for BirdLife Australia. I have been at BirdLife for a very, very long time, and in this role for a very long time as well. I'm an urban bird nerd. I love the birds that we see around us, and we have such an amazing and wonderful group of birds that occur in our gardens and urban spaces in Australia. And sometimes I don't think we realise just how lucky we are. And so the Urban Bird Program was started out of Birds in Backyards, which is the survey we're going to talk about today, really as a way for us at BirdLife Australia to connect with people and work on creating great spaces in our cities, creating havens really for nature, for birds and for people, because we're all linked, and the more birds we can get around us, the more nature we can encourage, the better our outcomes are going to be as well. And so we like to do our work through, monitoring of birds, of course, understanding what's going on with them, encouraging people to connect with nature in these activities and do a lot of that work themselves, as well as the research we do as well. We also do a lot of research with our citizen science data, but also through students or with other direct research that we might be involved in. And we also use what's called a conservation action plan to frame what we're working on. So we're trying to look at exactly what the issues are in urban spaces and work out strategies that we can test and ultimately promote urban birds in our towns and cities across Australia. Woo, that was too quick. Let's go back here. So let's talk about Birds in Backyards. So Birds in Backyards was the project that really started it all for BirdLife, for our Urban Bird Program. It started back in 1999, where we were looking to address the loss, particularly of small birds, from urban areas. Our Urban Bird Program has expanded since then, and we know that there are a lot of larger birds as well that are in a lot of trouble. So we don't just limit ourselves to small birds, but of course, small birds are lovely and engaging and wonderful to watch. And so we do a lot of work on them. And the vast majority of Australians live in urban spaces. So there is a lot of people that we can reach and a lot of people we can work with to conserve our birds. And with the Birds in Backyards program, we do that through providing people with information based on science. So it's either research that we have done ourselves or research that's been done by other academics that we're collaborating with or are doing work in the field in general. And we get that information out to people, providing them with things that they can do at home. So this is all information that you can take and take action in your own space to benefit your local bird life. We encourage people to change garden practices or take up gardening practices to help birds. And I'm a little bit biased, but birds are lovely and wonderful to have around us. And so we always try where we can to focus on the joy that birds can bring us in our teaching. We use a model, and I'll talk about it a little bit in a second, we encourage people through Birds in Backyards to learn about birds, to participate in citizen science, and to create space for birds. So every time you're getting something from us with Birds in Backyards, then we're thinking about how we can learn about birds, how we can participate in projects, and how we can create action for birds. The ultimate aim is, of course, that our private spaces in urban landscapes are great habitats for birds and for biodiversity in general, which then has great benefits for us. I'll talk a little bit later on about the Aussie bird count, because most of you have probably come to us through that. But the Aussie bird count is a once-a-year event. Birds in Backyards kind of is the next step up. And so we're going to be talking about these surveys today. And I will share that information and the differences with you shortly. Oh, and there's our little pardalote going. So how we do Birds in Backyards as a project has changed and evolved over the years. It's been a long time, of course, since this project started. So the Birds in Backyards exists through a website, birdsinbackyards.net, which has a lot of information about how to create spaces for birds, a lot of information about birds, although a lot of our fact sheets are now being migrated over to the new BirdLife Australia website as well, as has the Bird Finder, which is built in too. We produce a lot of resources. We have we do a lot of talks. We do webinars like tonight. We now have a presence on social media. So if anybody follows us on social media, you would have seen lately we've had a very big April where we're doing 30 days of gardening tips for birds, and it's been quite an adventure. There's certainly plenty of things to talk about. And we also do our newsletters, which is, of course, how you've heard from us. So when you are a BirdLife supporter, you can be registered as getting information from our programs in the urban team. So people participate through the Birds in Backyard surveys, which is, of course, why we're here tonight. And we also have a very active Facebook group, Birds in Backyards Australia, which you can join up as well. And then, of course, we're encouraging people to create space based on the information that we provide. So getting that gardening advice, learning about what the Birds in Backyard surveys are telling us, and then giving that information through and changing how you're gardening. There we go. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of the surveys and what the data tells us, I thought I'd just take us a little bit of a step back and talk about what surveys are. Before we dive into it, because as I said, I'm sure many of you have done the Aussie bird count, and that is one form of our surveys at BirdLife Australia. But overall, what we're talking about when we're talking about doing surveys is we're doing what we call structured monitoring. So structured monitoring is a way of going out and observing things in a consistent manner. So for us, of course, it's birds, but it could be a whole range of biodiversity as well. It's basically meaning that we are going out and doing the same methodology, the same way, across multiple people and across multiple locations. That means that through the genius data analysts that we have, or the amazing research students and things that might be working with us, they can then take that data, do a whole heap of amazing work with it, and come out with things like fancy graphs, like I've shown here, and give us some information about what it all means. It basically means if people are doing the same thing in different locations the same way, we can compare apples and apples. If somebody's going out and doing a Birds in Backyard survey, they're counting their birds for 5 minutes, but somebody's going out 3 times a day and counting for 3 hours, it's comparing apples and oranges. We need to have the same rigmarole around the survey methodology. And so the birds in backyard surveys particularly are a way for us to track how urban or suburban birds are going across particularly private land across Australia. So you're not limited to doing this just in a capital city. You can do this in any location across Australia. We have people, have someone in Norfolk Island doing the surveys for us at the moment as well, which is really exciting. So it's best suited to do in a garden, but you can do it in a range of habitats. You do the surveys through BirdData, which is our primary way that we collect bird surveys across BirdLife Australia. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. We have the BirdData web portal and we have the BirdData app. I'll actually take you through this exactly. We'll dive into BirdData tonight live and have a play around. And what you're doing is you're doing either a 20-minute count, preferably. So you're timing for 20 minutes and recording all the birds in your garden at that time, or you're telling us a weekly list and about how long that time has been, and you're giving us some garden information. So we ask you some questions about the type of garden you've got, what's going on within it, and we collect that for each of the bird surveys. And so we have a track of what your garden is like and what birds are in it over time. Before we dive into how to do it, I thought we might just look at how the data gets used first. And it can get used across a whole range of different ways, but I'm going to give you 3 little case studies tonight. So the first is looking at long-term data. So this is some research that's just been finished by Carly Campbell. She's a PhD student, or she's actually submitted now, from Griffith University in Queensland. And so Carly wanted to know what the long-term changes were in urban bird communities across Australia. So she focused on 4 capital cities, Brisbane, Sydney, Perth, and Melbourne, and used both BirdData, the data in our in BirdData, including birds in backyard surveys, and also data that was in eBird. And Carly had sort of 3 main questions. Which species have experienced change across these different cities and within the cities themselves as well? So this is going back to the 1960s, so a huge data set. Were the changes in the types of birds consistent between cities? So were the same birds in decline in different locations? And were there particular types of birds that are doing really well or not doing so well across the landscape? So this was a very long-term data set, as I said, pulling in from multiple sources, including birds in backyards. I'm not going to take you through all of her data. I'm just going to give you a couple of highlights. So let's get all these through. There we go. So what Carly did was be able to track which species did better over time and which species did worse over time from the sort of 50s and 60s through to today. And these are just 2 locations, just for Brisbane and Sydney. We can see that there are some clear winners. So in Brisbane, we've had the noisy miner, the corella, and the welcome swallow, interestingly, become much more common in their observations. Whereas the pale-headed rosella, the spotted dove as an introduced species, and the crested pigeon, interestingly, in Brisbane, were species that were shown to be doing worse than they used to be. In Sydney, we had the rainbow lorikeet, unsurprisingly, doing really well and showing an increase, same as the Australian white ibis, and of course the noisy miner again as well, doing really well. But we saw things like the house sparrow, again, an introduced bird, as well as the spotted dove, again, showing a decline, and the eastern rosella not doing as well as it used to be. So there's some consistencies there across, the eastern states. The noisy miner did well across the board, as did the rainbow lorikeet. But interestingly, there was quite a few cases of introduced species becoming much less common, which was quite surprising and not what I think most people would expect from this data. So some key results she found was, as I said, exotic species seem to be declining. This was house sparrows, particularly spotted doves as well. I believe Brisbane common miners were less common, interestingly, too, which I'm sure many people are grateful for. We saw that the really native successful species, those that can exploit the urban environment really well, so the ones that do really well living with us, were increasing. So that includes things like your noisy miners, of course, rainbow lorikeets, white ibis, sulphur-crested cockatoos and corellas. We saw that birds that we assume would be common in urban spaces are actually showing some signs of decline. That was in things like the laughing kookaburra and the pale-headed rosella, as well as some of the other rosella species across the whole weren't doing particularly well. And frustratingly, there was differences between cities in terms of the birds that were doing well or not doing well. And there wasn't a clear set of traits. So there wasn't sort of, it wasn't all migratory birds were not doing well, or most migratory birds were not doing well, or smaller birds overall tended to do worse. There was a lot of mixed results, which means that those local landscape characteristics are really important for determining what birds you're getting in your communities. Unfortunately, the species traits were not consistent between those locations. Makes it a bit hard to make those recommendations and to combat these issues when there's so much noise and there's so many differences going on at a very local level, which means that data coming in is really, really important, because we can best make recommendations if we've got data coming in from the local area, simply because of all those changes that occur. And then a couple of examples of data using just birds in backyards. So this is some research that Karen Tong from the University of Melbourne did last year as part of her master's project. Karen looked at the birds in backyards data and particularly focused on bird feeding and how actions around bird feeding changed the bird communities that were being recorded. So what she asked were what sort of foods were being put out in people that were doing birds in backyard surveys. Were there different types of birds at sites where there was feeding compared to sites where there was no feeding? And particularly, how were small birds impacted by feeding? And so I'll take you through just the key highlights. So this is a little map that just shows where all the data came from. So she just looked at sort of the wider Greater Sydney region, which was, almost 600 sites. Just under 2,000 surveys went into this data, where she saw about 200 different bird species in the data set. So interestingly, this chart just shows the proportion of people that fed or provided water for birds compared to those who didn't. And this is just the people that do the birds in backyard surveys, remember. So we had about a quarter of the participants provided either food or food and water together. So 25% is actually relatively low. Estimates amongst the general population suggest that something like 50% of people provide food for birds. So this is probably on the low side because people who are involved in birds in backyards have maybe heard us talking about bird feeding and issues around bird feeding before, so they're less likely to take part in it. A lot of people provided water. So the vast majority, so just under 40% of people provided water, or just over a third just relied on their actual garden rather than any other additional provisions. And what she found was, as I said, feeding wasn't particularly common. So just about a quarter of participants had put food out for birds. Seed was the most common food that was put out by quite a lot. And the bird communities overall didn't change between whether there was bird feeding or not. Common birds were just common everywhere. And so most of those common birds are birds that occupy huge areas, things like sulphur-crested cockatoos, rainbow lorikeets. Not everybody has a flock of gangangs coming in to feed. We're talking about these really common species. They're occupying huge areas. Whether there's food there or not is not going to influence whether they're coming into a garden. They're just in the area. They do really well whether there's food there or not. But it looks like providing food does have an impact on some of the smaller and more vulnerable, less common bird species. So small birds overall were less likely to be found at gardens where there was food provided compared to sites where there was no food. And the type of food that was provided also impacted what was going on too. So if gardens provided meat, um, unsurprisingly, they had more carnivorous species in their gardens, but they also had less insectivorous species. So the birds that eat insects, willy wagtails, wrens and things were less likely to be in gardens when there was meat provided. If people provided seed for birds, they were more likely to have seed eaters, which is what they would be going for. And they were also more likely to have fruit eaters in their garden. And I think that's probably because there's a bit of overlap in diet. Even though we may classify something as a fruit eater, chances are it will also eat some seed and a few other bits and pieces as well. Diet is not always particularly rigid with birds. There's quite a bit of flexibility. So I suspect that that's why there's sort of some fruit eating birds coming in, because they're coming in for that seed too. And Karen found that when seed was provided with some sort of water source as well, that's when you had most sort of the maximum small bird diversity in gardens. So supplementary food, so putting that food out, is definitely playing a part in the types of birds that are coming in. And then just to finish up on an example of what we do with the data, I just wanted to talk about the garden information that we collect. And I'll take you through that shortly. But that's sort of one of the big things about the Birds in Backyard surveys, is we collect information on the types of gardens and what goes on in them, such as bird feeding. That's because we can then look at what bird communities are in these gardens and then see what is attracting different birds, or what's maybe causing some birds to be absent. It helps us make recommendations for councils, or back to participants, or to the general public. So this involves us, not particularly me. I can't do data analysis anymore. The amazing data analytics team that we have at BirdLife, running some models, looking at the presence of different birds with the range of these features. So these are some of the highlights. What is very, very clear when you look at this data is actually defining a bird-friendly garden is near on impossible. Different birds, of course, like different things. And so we see that species respond very individually. And in fact, one thing we've found when we've been looking at the data recently is that even in different states, the same birds can be responding to different garden features. So there's still a lot to go through with this. It does tend to hold true, though, that you tend to find native birds in the gardens with mostly native vegetation, which is very unsurprising, but really nice when the data holds true and shows that. Conversely, introduced birds like miners and spotted doves were more likely to be found in gardens where there was no native plants or lower tree cover as well. We also find that, of course, a lot of small birds showed quite a preference for having a lot of shrub layer in gardens, so where there's sort of more than 50% shrub cover. And that's when you get particularly things like eastern spinebills, superb fairy wrens and silver eyes showing a positive relationship. But what's good for one species is not always good for the others. So we find that while these three guys liked a lot of shrub layer, we found that spinebills, silver eyes, New Holland honeyeaters and red wattlebirds as well also preferred gardens with little to no lawn. So they like that really dense stuff where there isn't a lot of open space. However, superb fairy wrens are the other way. They like a lot of shrub layer, but they also like to have access to some lawn. So different birds showing sort of these different preferences. And even we found that some species were using gardens for different reasons. So we had particularly yellowtail black cockatoos, king parrots, and magpie larks, either preferring to be in gardens with a large amount of lawn or no lawn. So but all of these species were either in this type or this type, not in the middle, or less commonly in the middle, I should say. That suggests that these birds are coming in and using gardens for different purposes. So they're not always just coming in attracted to the one particular feature. So something like magpie larks in particular, will come down and feed on lawn space. So maybe they're looking for a lot of open lawn, but then when it's time to roost and when they're potentially looking for a nest site, they're preferring sites with less lawn because they want a lot of tree cover. So it just goes to show that even, coming up with a formula for a particular species isn't always clear cut. There's a whole range of different features that they could be looking for in a garden. And then finally, we know that where you live, of course, matters. So if you are close to a patch of bushland, you're more and by close, I'm meaning sort of 50 meters away, like really close, you're more likely to have things like spotted pardalotes, laughing kookaburras, yellow-tailed black cockatoos, king parrots in your garden. But if you are sort of in a sweet spot, so somewhere between about 50 meters from a patch of bush or up to about 5 kilometers away, that's where gardens tended to get the highest different numbers of highest bird diversity. So the highest different number of species within them. And that's sort of a bit of a sweet spot. So that's probably because birds are moving around the landscape. And so if they're looking for a lot of things in that sort of buffer zone to stop off on the way to the next patch of bushland. Once you get about 5 kilometers from a patch of bush, the types of birds you get drops off significantly, and you're probably in a very, very highly urbanized environment with some feral pigeons, probably a few ibis, some rainbow lorikeets, and not a lot else. So it's all a little bit confusing. It means that the data can be quite messy, but the urban landscape is confusing. There is a lot going on. There are a lot of people that have a lot of say on little patches of land. So it means that surveys are really important because the more data we can feed in, the clearer some of these relationships become, and we can start to get information, particularly at local levels. So we know that what's good in one state for a species doesn't necessarily hold true in another. So we need to get that local information so we can provide local knowledge back to people and make the best suggestions for their area. And so it does inform the materials that we develop. So we've got a new Back to Nature guideline document, which is going out to councils soon. So this information gets fed into there, and it gets fed into what we feed back to people as individuals. So through our social media or through our newsletters in things like how to attract different species to your garden. And so I'm just going to quickly check. How are we going here? I got no one else in the waiting room. I'm just double checking because I hadn't checked for a bit. Okay. So as I said earlier, I'm sure a lot of you have come to us through the Aussie Bird Count, which is fantastic. And so there can be a little bit of confusion between a Birds in Backyard survey and an Aussie Bird Count survey. So before we dive into the surveys themselves, let's just have a look at the differences between the two. So the Birds in Backyard surveys have been around since about 2005. Aussie Bird Count, I think we're coming up on our 10th year now. So it actually sort of evolved out of the Birds in Backyard surveys. The Aussie Bird Count is a once a year event. So third week in October is Bird Week. That's when we hold our Aussie Bird Count. And so it gives us a snapshot of what's going on in across Australia for birds during that week. That just short chunk of time. Sort of gets talked a bit like a census. It's only happening in one short time period, but every year. It's only recording the birds, so we're not recording guarding characteristics, and it's just anywhere you can see within the space you're settled in. Okay, you do the Aussie Bird Count survey through the Aussie Bird Count app or through the specific Aussie Bird Count website, and that's separate to how we do our Birds in Backyards surveys. So our Birds in Backyard surveys are available year round to do. So you can jump on at any time and do a survey. We tend to promote them seasonally, and we analyse them through the year seasonally. So at the moment, we're just coming to the end of the autumn surveys, and we'll do a little bit of analysis there before getting everybody kicking off for winter in June. We ask people, of course, to record the birds in your garden and also the characteristics of that garden, so answering some of the questions. And we're talking about the birds that are physically using the space. So it's not necessarily something that's flying over and not paying attention. Because we relate it back to the garden characteristics, we really want to know about the birds that are just encompassing that space. The data gets collected through the BirdData app. And so that's where the vast majority of BirdLife Australia's data comes into. So it's an app or a website. I'll show you in a minute. And so that login that you will need to do is different to the Aussie bird count. So if you pop your email address into the Aussie bird count, it doesn't mean you can access bird data. You need to actually go through, unfortunately, a separate registration process. We'll talk about that now. So my advice to you before you get out and do a Birds in Backyard survey, which hopefully some of you will do next, register for bird data and have a look around and have a play around with it first. Don't get yourself frazzled and think that you've got to try and work out how to use this app or this web portal for the first time and watch the birds at the same time. Just have a play around first. You can go through and put a dummy count in, just don't click submit, but go through and have a practice as a bit of a draft, play around with and see if you can follow everything. And it's a good idea too, because the Birds in Backyard surveys ask for data, ask for garden information, to take a bird's eye view of your garden. Sorry to use that pun. Take a look and see what features you have. So we'll ask things like, you know, how many big trees do you have? Do you have mostly lawn? Do you feed birds? We'll go through and have a look at those categories in a minute, but it's a good idea to sort of put yourself in the position of a bird and have a think about those sort of features before you start. It also helps you when you're going to do your bird watching, of course, to know where to have a bit of a look. Get a hold of any accessories if you need them. If you're in your garden, you might not necessarily need to have binoculars. They can certainly be handy if you've got some little birds flitting through. But the good thing about, you know, our backyards is that, you know, we can generally see everything relatively close and we might not need them. So it's not a prerequisite that you have binoculars to do the surveys. It's always handy to have a field guide or an app though, of course. So most field guides are in app form now. I can certainly recommend some if people are interested. We'll also do, as an aside, an intro to bird watching session for people coming up soon. So keep an eye out for that webinar that will be coming. And that will give you lots more information as well. But, you know, you can pick up a field guide for sort of $30, $40. Apps are about the same price, which sounds really expensive for an app, but I have to say they're pretty great to have. And that means they're in your pocket and you've got a field guide with you everywhere you go. And then get ready. So you've registered for bird data, you are ready to go, you've got your equipment, settle yourself in. You don't need to go wandering around. A lot of this I like to think of as a bit of a relaxation activity as well. So just make yourself a cup of something nice, find a nice sunny cozy spot, settle in and watch your birds for 20 minutes. You're ready to go. So this is bird data. I will take you through it all shortly. So bird data has a whole range of features. This is the web portal. So you can see it has information. You won't need to worry about the admin. That's just because I can access and I'm logged in at the moment. You'll have a My Data section, which is all your bird surveys. You can record your surveys. You can explore the data. You can request any data if you're with an institution, you've got some particular concerns. You can do a whole range of things. We'll have a look at it live in a sec. There is also the app as well. I'm not going to take you through the app live. I'll show you some screenshots in a bit. But the first thing to do is to register for bird data. So if you go to the bird data web portal, there will be a little register or sign in button. You can then go to create an account. And you'll get this little form. You just fill in your details. You'll then use your email address as your login and you will set yourself a password. Then when you have the bird data app, likewise, you'll have to log in with the same username and password to be able to use that. And then this is just showing a bit of a bird data screen. But I want to dive into it now. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen. And I'm going to hopefully share another screen. Let's go here. Okay, can everybody see my bird data up on the screen, hopefully? There we go. Hopefully everybody's got it. Nobody's typing furiously that they don't. So we've registered for bird data, we've signed in, and so we're sitting on the web portal. So you can see there's all these fancy buttons across the top, but let's just have a bit of a look at how bird data is set out. This is quite a new layout for us, and it looks very clean and very lovely. So there's lots of different extra information in here. So it's not just all give us data. There are lots of bits and pieces for you to explore. So you can learn about ID tips here for leaden and satin flycatchers, different projects that are going on. So if you're in Vic, Beach Nesting Birds project needs people who to count hoodies and hopefully look for eastern ground parrots, which would be very nice to see. The Superb City Wrens project is active at the moment. If you are in Melbourne and want to head out to Royal Park, you can go and see some of our beautifully little colour banded fairy wrens and let us know which birds you've seen around Royal Park. So there's lots of different information there for you to check out. You can see statistics for what's going on overall. So this week there's been over 1,000 surveys submitted. So far this year, we're at about 25,000 surveys, which is a little bit up on last year, which is excellent to see. And you can play around with this in different states and territories. You can get a look at your data. I haven't done enough surveys this year. I need to get cracking. So your data is summarised there as well. You can explore some information. There's a whole range of things in here. There's a bit of a leader tally too. So have a bit of a play around, but let's go and do a survey. So we're going to go to record survey, of course, and that's going to open up all of the different bird data surveys that are here. So you can have a bit of a play around. Of course, I'm going to suggest you all go to the Birds in Backyard survey. Birds in Backyard surveys or the general bird data surveys are going to be the basic all-encompassing bird surveys that are applicable for most people. And then if you have a particular hankering for beach nesting birds, or you want to get involved in something like the Powerful Owl project in the urban team, you can then go to those projects as well. But let's look at Birds in Backyards. And so we click next, and then we have to choose a site. And so you're going to be setting up a new site. So I'm going to scroll through and set up a new site. Notice there's no map at the moment because we don't have a location. So we're going to go through and just pick the type of space we're looking at. We're pretty much always going to be in an urban garden or something similar. We're going to go to the BirdLife office at Sydney Olympic Park, Jameson Street, Sydney Olympic Park. Let's see. There we go. Close enough. So it's popped a pin. I'm going to just check out where that pin is and go, yeah, it's pretty close to work. And you can move that pin. So if it hasn't found you exactly, you can move it. The app will geolocate you wherever you are. And if you are outside of where there is signal, it will remember the survey and you can set up your location later. So you can move your pin around to the location where you are at. So we're going to be about here. I'm going to say this is where I'm going. And then I'm going to click next, which is going to take me to about my site. And so this is all the garden information that I was telling you about. Now it looks like a lot first up, but I'll point out that you only actually have to do this once. So once you've filled in this information, you don't have to do it again. Unless something in your garden changes and you need to update things, it's just one and done. So you fill in the information. What sort of plants are in your garden? What sort of trees in particular? How many of them? About how big is your garden? So you can just give us a very rough estimate. That just helps us sort of categorize whether we're dealing with small gardens or large gardens. You can certainly go on Google Earth and just map out about how big it is. It just needs to be an approximate. And then this is where the bird's eye view stuff comes in. About how much lawn do you have? Looking down, maybe you've got about a quarter of the garden. What sort of small plants? Maybe you've just got a few. Maybe you've done some great planting and you've got lots of shrubs, so more than half your garden is shrubs. Maybe you've got, a few trees. You've got a good tree canopy. And then maybe you may have a driveway, you may have some paving, you may have some gravel pathways somewhere as well. So you just look at what that composition is. What sort of animals do you have? Now, this is going to vary, of course, depending on if you're surveying in a front yard or a backyard. As an aside, we're going to be simplifying some of this down shortly. So don't worry too much about all the detail here. We're going to make this a little bit easier. But think about what sort of animals come through your place. Do you have dogs that come through? If you've got a front yard, then yep, at least once a day, there's probably a dog coming through. Are there cats that access your yard? If you're like my place where there are some neighbours' cats, then yes, there's probably some cats around. Are there chickens? Maybe never. Or if this was my backyard, then yes, there would be chickens. Are there other animals that are around if you've got rabbits or if you've got, a whole range of other things coming through? And then if you own them, are they there all the time or do they come and go? So the dogs, do they have full access to the garden? Are they always there? Are they sometimes there? If they're like my dogs, they've technically got partial access to the garden, but they're basically inside. So even though maybe I've got cats coming through the yard, I don't actually own any cats. Maybe I don't have chickens. You just go through each of those categories. And then do you provide resources for birds and what do you provide? So do you put meat out and how often? Similarly with seed, bread, honey or nectar mixes. And do you have water available? So that could be a pond, it could be a bird bath, could be a pool. If you've got that water, how often is it available? So then we can just sort of look at whether things are frequently there or infrequently there. If you've got a nest box, you can add that information in there too and tell us the type of nest box that you've got. So as I said, there's a lot there. It takes a little bit first up to get through it all, but it's a one-off. So when you come back and do a survey again, you don't have to put that information in again. It will just say, oh, you're at the same site. Has anything changed? Yes or no. If the answer is no, green light, go straight through to the next section. If the answer is yes, then we just have to see what has changed and you just update the category that's changed. Then we go to next and we come to our details. So what sort of survey are we doing? As I said earlier, we do two different types of surveys with birds in backyards. You can do a 20-minute count or you can do a weekly list. So 20-minute counts are definitely preferable for us. It's a lot easier to do things with the data, but we know that some people just have a running tally that they keep, when they're coming and going through the house, through the garden, they just keep a list over the week of what they've seen. So by all means, you can send that data through too. If you do that, just let us know, overall, it was about an hour and a half in total I was probably watching, or maybe it was only 30 minutes, but just over that week, how much time have you spent? But we do, when we surveyed, what time we started, how many of us were there? Did we record all the surveys? Anytime you hover over one of these little question marks, it will give you some information. So if I took a good stab and I reckon I recorded all the species, you can get that tick. That's certainly the intention with the Birds in Backyard surveys, to try and record everything. Don't beat yourself up if you happen to miss something or you can't quite get an ID. It's not the end of the world. Water level is an ignore. You don't have to worry about that one. That's just in as a stock standard across all the bird data surveys, but it's not applicable for us. And then you also have an option to select if you're going to keep your survey private or not. So if we go into the explore function in BirdData, you can go through and see what other people have seen. You can't find out information about the person that did the surveys, but you can see that there have been surveys coming in from all sorts of different locations, and this place here saw rainbow lorikeets and noisy miners, but this place here saw a powerful owl, or this place here saw a western ground parrot, except western ground parrots won't show up in there. So you can go through and you can have that data available in BirdData, or if you don't want your lists available in the explore function, you click private survey, and it means it's only accessible behind the scenes. So when we're doing data analysis and we need the data set, we can access it, but otherwise it's not accessible to the general BirdData user. Let us know the type of experience. So are you a beginner? Are you pretty okay at bird watching, or are you pretty confident and you're an experienced bird watcher? It's just a bit of a self-rating system. You can select if you're doing a particular survey for us. We have a whole range, as you can see. So at the moment, we're in sort of the autumn survey period, so you can certainly select that. And again, bushfire assessments is something that came out of the 2019-2020 fires, not really something that's applicable for us in birds in backyards. And finally, we can do a bird survey. So when you get into the portal and you've selected a location, the really handy thing about BirdData is it pulls out a list of birds that you are likely to see based on your area. So it helps out because it gives you a name and it gives you an image. And so you can scroll through and then decide if that's a species that you've seen or not. Otherwise, you can simply just type the name in the little tab at the start. But most of the time, people are going to see something like an Australian magpie. They go, yep, I saw in my 20 minutes, I saw 3. They weren't doing anything particularly startling. Maybe they were playing and wrestling, as they're known to do sometimes. Potentially coming up soon, you know, in a couple of months, there may be some breeding activity. So if you see nest building, if you see some sort of courtship displays, if you see young being fed, you can select those there. This is all the optional extras. At a minimum, what we want to know is what you saw and how many you saw. Anything else is a bonus. So fill in that information if you like. And if you saw them getting cranky or interacting with other birds, you can let us know too. So you just would tick this little box and go, it was Australian magpies and a golden plover for some reason. They were interacting. Was it aggressive? Yes. What was the reason? Were they fighting over resource? Was it a breeding aggression? Was it some sort of mobbing, like a bird mobbing an owl or a predator? Was it a predator trying to grab some prey, or was there no obvious reason? So you can just select whether it was successful. Yes, the magpie was after the golden plover and to eat, and yes, it got it. So you can fill in that information. You can do things like attach photos. You can fill in any notes if you like. I love going through the notes section when I go through the data, because I can see some really interesting stories and people sharing, you know, this is the, you know, I haven't seen this species before, or this is the first time I've seen these guys in 3 years, or a hobby came over and everything went really quiet. There's some really interesting things come out of that. So you go through, you fill in which species you saw. If it's something different, you could say you saw an eastern spinebill maybe, and you'll notice here, just while I've got this typed out, that you've got green and red writing. So green means this species occurs within the location where you are. Red means it doesn't occur within the location you're in, so chances are it's not a sighting. That's not to say that there are not vagrants and things that pop up. So if you're very confident, by all means, include that sighting. But someone in the BirdData team may get really excited and get in touch with you to try and see what was going on. So you can certainly flag it. So you can say you saw a spinebill. You'll see, because I selected Sydney Olympic Park, that we actually collect data on frogs. That won't be in any other survey outside of Sydney Olympic Park. So you can say maybe you saw spinebills, which would be lovely. I have one in my area that has come everywhere except my garden, and I'm really annoyed. But hopefully one day he will. So maybe I saw that. And then for your 20 minutes or your weekly list, you just fill out what you've seen. You then click review and submit, and this will give you a summary. So what it's saying is that I've got all these issues because I haven't filled in all of this information. So I need to go through here. And then you'll go through your summary. And once all that information is correct and I haven't missed anything, like all these are filled in, I will be able to submit my survey and done. So I'm going to jump back over to my talk, and I'm just conscious of time. I just wanted to really quickly make sure I showed you all what the app looks like. So hopefully everybody's good there. So this is the BirdData app screen, home screen. So when you go there for the first time, you'll of course log in with your BirdData ID, and then you will click record survey. You're going to get the same questions in that as you got on the web portal. So you're going to be selecting the type of survey that you're going to do. You're then going to select the location. So as you can see, I've done a lot of surveys in this site. Really, what you should be doing is selecting the same location. So clicking on that dot. A real key trick with BirdData, both in the web portal and on the app, is to make sure you zoom in a lot. So get in nice and close, making sure you're really accurate on where your dot is. And so then when you go back and do a repeat survey for the same spot, you can just go back in, and if you zoom in enough, you can click that point. All your birds in backyards data is of course associated with that point, and it will all be remembered. And then of course you're going to fill out the details. So that's here on the left. So anytime there's a little arrow, you will click that button and it will open up a little template. So you're selecting your survey period, how many people there were. You're going to fill out the garden information if you hadn't before, what sort of experience level, etc. You're then going to record sightings, sorry. And then that middle screen will show up blank at first until you pop into the search by species name tab, and then you will get a list of birds pop up that you can scroll through and either select one of those, or you can type in the name of the bird that you saw. When you select one of those birds, so we've selected a rainbow lorikeet, that information about the sighting detail will pop up. So you'll say how many you saw, if there was anything else interesting, if you want to tell us about it, that goes in there. And then you click done, and it will take you back to that middle tile there. So before we get to the chat, because there's probably a few questions, just a few tips to go through. So a couple of these I've touched on already. Firstly, like I said before, when you are setting your location, it's a really good idea to zoom in close. So on the app, of course, pinching in, using the plus button on the map on the web portal to zoom in nice and close. You can, of course, survey your front yard and your backyard. I do both sites. The best advice for us to make sure that they're independent is to survey them on different days. So don't do your front yard and your backyard on the same day. Do them on different days, because then we've got a different suite of birds coming around. It just helps us with the analysis. It's really great if people can do repeat surveys. So ideally what we suggest and what we hope is that people do one survey a season. So a survey in autumn, survey in winter, then in spring, then in summer. You can do more. By all means, knock yourselves out. The more data, the better. But if we can get that bare minimum of 4 a year, that is incredibly helpful for us. Those repeat surveys really help us build up a picture at a local level of what's going on. As I said before, you only have to do that garden info once at each site unless something changes. So if you unfortunately lose a tree, or maybe you do some planting, or you put in a bird bath, you then will update those details. Then we know at that point in time that feature changed and these are the birds that we get now. As I said before, only count the birds that are in your yard, so the ones that are using the space. If you get something like welcome swallows that are flying through and not landing, still count them, because of course they're still using the space. They're just above in the air, they're not landing. And if you've got something like a bird of prey coming through, then I would count that as well, because that bird is searching your yard, and so it's still using the resources, it's still looking for prey. So by all means count those. But if, for example, a flock of rainbow lorikeets goes like a bullet through your yard and doesn't give it a second glance, we don't need to worry about including those. It's only when they're actually landing in your yard, having a feed, walking around and causing chaos. You can identify birds by call as well. Doesn't need to be only the birds that you see. If you can identify the call, by all means, go for it. But likewise, if you're not confident, then don't worry about including birds that you've heard. If you make a mistake too, don't panic. It's okay. We all do. And remember, the data gets vetted as well. So there are people that go through and we check data, and when we go through and do our analysis, we take a look at everything. But you can go in and change anything where you've made a mistake. So maybe you've picked the wrong location, or you've thought about a bird and you're like, you know what? No, it actually wasn't a brown thornbill, it was a striated thornbill. If you go into the web portal, so not the app, if you go into the web portal and you go to the My Data section, all your surveys are listed there, and you can go in and edit and make any changes that you need to. And the other thing I think is really important to remember is that this is not all about taking data from you. BirdData is there for you to explore and use as well. And so by all means do it. It's a really cool platform. There are a whole heap of features in there to explore, particularly that explore function. And I don't really have time tonight to take you through it all. But go onto the web portal, not the app. The app doesn't have the explore function built in, but the web portal does. You go to explore, you can search by state, you can search by local government area, you can search by program, you can search by species. So if you want to know about, where have all the superb fairy wrens been seen between 2016 and today, you can put those categories in and it will give you a map and show you where superb fairy wrens have been sighted. It can help you plan trips. You can plan your holiday around what birds you want to go and see at what location. It can help you with, if you've got a concern around a development application and you want to know what bird species are around and are likely to be impacted, you can play around in BirdData and get an idea of what's been seen in your area. It has a whole range of different uses. So I'd encourage you to get in and have a play around. Before we finish, I am just going to check the chat. So if you've got a question, pop it in. I can see lots of lovely comments, which is nice. Amanda, 50 to 60 black cockatoos in your yard today. You win. There was no competition, but the prize is yours. That is fantastic. Oh, someone else from Darwin. Nice. Bowerbirds are around today. I get bowerbirds around. I haven't seen many around lately. So I'm thinking they won't be too far behind. Kiri's got little red rump parrots, beautiful, wonderful. I'll say, Amanda, they were just flying over. Still win. That's still a very nice sighting to have 50 or 60 black cockatoos. I'm assuming yellowtails. That was fantastic. That's really great. So, and again, any comments or questions, pop them in. Otherwise, I'm not going to play the video, but I will share it with you afterwards. So this is just a really simple 2-minute how to do a survey. So instead of me talking at you for an hour, you could have just watched a 2-minute video. But it just gives you the overview of how to do it. So if you want a little refresher, I'll send that to everybody. And so for more information, I am going to, when I finish the recording, tidy it all up, upload it probably to YouTube. I will share it then with everybody. So everybody who came tonight, as well as people who couldn't come along, but I will also give you guys a suite of resources as well. So we've got some PDFs and things with all the instructions I can share with you. If you have issues with logging on to BirdData, so if you're having password issues or your data's gone a bit screwy, something's not quite right, contact BirdData at birdlife.org.au. Their email address will be on the web portal, and the lovely team will be able to sort that out for you. I am not technically handy at all, but I can handle specific birds in backyard survey questions, or urban birdie questions in general, concerns, anything like that. Pop me an email. That's my email address there. You'll hear from me either tomorrow or early next week anyway, so feel free to follow up. I thank you for coming along today. I hope you enjoyed the session, and I hope you learnt a lot. As I said, it was great to get our first one up and running. So stay tuned. We will do another Birds Meet series next month. I'm not going to give away what it's going to be yet, but there's some really exciting ones coming up. I'm really thrilled to be doing these. It's great. Thank you everybody for coming along. I'm going to stop the recording. There we go.